Good morning. This will be message 8 of 8 characteristics of living things. Life changes over time. One major contrast that must be made between a purely scientific and not spiritual understanding of life and a more spiritual understanding of life is that a scientist with no belief in creation, and they're not mutually exclusive, will defer to the idea of evolution as a strong theory, even perhaps a natural law. As I said more sarcastically in the song, "Who Put the Words in Charlie's Mouth?" I believe that Darwin noticed microevolution. That is, God has given within your DNA the capacity to adjust and become a better version of yourself to adapt to your surroundings. But that macroevolution requires as much, if not more, faith than a belief in a creator, because if one is to build a value system about reality off of the fossil record, one must take essentially upon faith. The evidence of things not seen steps between one species and another species, which I believe is a cleverly crafted tool of the devil to keep some of society's most inquisitive minds indoctrinated against belief in a creator. So it is my belief that God has put the possibility of microevolution into species. What you see in Darwin's work is, a species of bird that has many subspecies on geographically isolated islands that have differently shaped beaks that allow for them to exploit differently sized and shaped foods. Or things like island giantism or island dwarfism, which do not constitute evolving out of one species into another. What the word says in Genesis 1:1 is that God created the heavens and the earth. We're not given a method. It could be God speaks, snaps his fingers, and exists. It could be there is a method that he is choosing not to share that is more observable by science. I consider that an unknown other than God created, and I believe that. The gospel message is like that. It is unchanging. That is, it will always be true that God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, who would not perish, but have everlasting life. It will always be true that God desired to make man in his own image so that people of free will could love him for who he is, and because of free will, it could open the door to sin, which then created the need for a Savior to pay the debt that we had toward a holy and just God. Those things will always be true, but the method by which those things are communicated is always changing. In Acts 17:16 through 34, Paul reaches the Greek stronghold of Athens. His journey, of course, begins in a more culturally Jewish, Jewishly is not a word, though it sounds like one, culturally Jewish place, and many of his early apostolic efforts involved going into the local synagogues of, let's call them uncompleted Jews, people who sincerely believed in their pre-Christian Jewish faith and were waiting for Messiah, and Paul would communicate with them in that way. As essentially, I think, the world's first person to communicate that message to uncompleted Jews other than Jesus himself. He arrives at something radically different. The Athens culture is truly idolatrous. It is truly polytheistic. To get an idea of exactly how polytheistic they were, you would have to read what we would consider to be Greek mythology. Fortunately, it was one of my interests as a pre-adolescent to read through all the mythology that I could find. So, I know about things like Jupiter and Hermes. Their idea that things about nature were manifest in these god creatures that had power over the destiny, and sometimes would just mess with them, but I mean, if you were to worship them, they would favor you, and your war would go better, your farming would go better, your ability to make children would go better. It's a concept that is natural to man, who is made to worship something in the absence of knowing the true God. It's evidence of our creation as a puzzle piece that only makes absolute sense in connection with its creator. It will always act as if it's missing something, and always look to fill that with something we can worship, because humans, no matter whether we call ourselves atheists or call ourselves agnostic or call ourselves against the idea of a God, your actions will demonstrate an inherent longing for a relationship with God. This culture was so idolatrous that it says that Paul's spirit is stirred. If you look at those words carefully, we see that it is his pneuma, and that's the word for the part of us that is spiritual and able to relate to God and worship God and hear God's voice. And so that's the living thing inside of him. Now, secondly, stirred will mean agitated, sharpened. It could actually mean anger. It could actually mean despise. So he is drawn to anger and drawn to hatred of the perspective, hatred of these insane ideas. Polytheism is a very strange and difficult belief system to try and wrap your head around if you've known the true God for any time period. Now I'm reminded of when Moses loses his temper and he hits a rock, and it has these lasting consequences for the remainder of his earthly life. Now Paul doesn't hit anybody, but it's just he runs into a crowd of people, and then he's moved. Now I think that one of the indicators of how God has made him for the function he's doing, this apostolic work, is his ability to respond so differently to these massive cultural differences. I think that that capacity is one of the key apostolic characteristics. We look at, did this person travel, did this person plant churches, did this person father all of these disciples, but how quickly would any kind of cross-cultural, intercultural evangelism or apostolic work fail if the minute that a cultural thing was so bizarre and offensive to you, it just shut you down. We know that Peter was asked to have unclean people come and eat unclean things with them, and he needed visions from God, a vision from God that was going to correct him directly, because that was far outside what he was capable of. And it was necessary for the work of God to continue for him to respond correctly to that. Because I believe that the only issue that God considers an A-level issue is the gospel itself. that other things are minute, and unfortunately our cultural upbringing can be a thorn in our side as far as how to respond to these things. Now, while Paul was offended, he used it constructively and was able to adjust the gospel message. Now, just to talk about the Athenian culture, and looking at its 10 minutes and 30 seconds right now, I'm going to describe the Athenian culture and then stop this and do a part two. The Athenian culture was very like us and very unlike us. It says that their main pastime was getting interested in new ideas, which means you never get deep on anything. It's a very polytheistic perspective. As a result, they had a temple or a monument to an unknown god, because just in case they hadn't covered all their knowledge of all the gods, the pantheon was incomplete. They were going to make sure they had him covered, whoever that him is. But always interested in new things reminds me of our current media. We have been slowly indoctrinated to have these very short goldfish-like attention spans where they know we can be distracted from this bad thing by this other bad thing. That is, if there was to be a military action on the part of a government that you supported, doing a military action you did not agree with in a foreign land, and you got offended, the next day's news, if it's more exciting or different, you're going to forget, or at least forget the intensity of your feelings about how offended you were. And thus, it means that, literally a person could come to town every day preaching a new God, and have their full attention, and it wouldn't sink in, and they would, the next day, talk to someone else about a new God. This God is pizza. This God is sports TV. This God is cars. The God of cars? And get really interested and stoked, and then it's thinking about the parable of the talents, it's a seed that goes into a shallow ground that is choked by thorns. And the way that they're not like us is you and I live in a place so thoroughly indoctrinated with Jesus-ism, whether or not those people are sincere believers. Everyone knows the name Jesus. All the atheists already have an opinion about Jesus and about you because you believe in Jesus. That's the reason sometimes you don't tell them, because you know they have a negative opinion, you can't handle hearing it. There's not many places left in this world where you can say Jesus and they go, what are you talking about? This is a strange new God. November 17, 2018, a young man named John Allen Chow took it upon himself to be the person who was going to bring the gospel to the inhabitants of the isolated North Sentinel Island, for which he was killed. I believe he was doing what God asked him to do, and I believe he was a bold, brave man who will be honored in heaven for what he did. He was 26 years old, and he was willing to go and meet with these people on this island so that they would have the opportunity to meet Jesus. This island is so isolated because it's part of the nation of India that's polytheistic themselves, that they're gonna, fine, we don't know what they believe, we don't know what they want, we're gonna leave them alone. People could be as few as 5 and as many as 500.